I'm Pamela Pike, and this is actually the second of a series. Well, I won't say a series, but it's the second webinar that I've given on adult teaching. I prefer to think of it as adult learning and how we work with adults. But this one is going to look at how we really create that environment where our adult students feel safe and comfortable and really in a place where they're ready to kind of go on that journey of learning to play the piano and learning music. There is a handout for today's session, but I'm not going to post it just yet. Instead, I'd rather that you just sort of sit back, kind of watch the slides, if you will. Just notice which words stand out to you, which topics resonate with you. You can certainly pop questions in the chat as they occur. I will save some time for questions at the end, but just know that the important pieces of all of this information that I share with you today will be available on a handout for you. So you do not need to sit there and take copious notes while we're doing this. So again, thanks for joining me, and let's go ahead and I will start my slides. So, as noted, this is the title of my presentation, and as you settle in with your tea or coffee, your glass of water, this is a little overview of what I'd like us to consider today. So we will together explore our role, that's the role of the piano teacher when it comes to working with adults. But that hopefully is something that I will be encouraging you to think a little bit about or think more deeply about as we go through the next 55 minutes together. We'll also explore just a very few of the motivations for adults to study piano. As you can imagine, and if you have taught adult students, you know that the reasons, the motivators for studying piano are as numerous as there are students in your studio. But there are probably some themes, similarities, and I'll be sharing just a few stories with you as we go through of adults that have either been in my studio or I've met when I've been out in other studios researching adults and speaking with adults, because I really believe in the power of story and the power of that narrative to really just drill down and get to the heart of an issue. And in this case, it really, I think the stories I'll share will be getting to the heart of motivation for studying piano. And finally, I would like us to explore some strategies that will help both us, the facilitators. I'm assuming we're all piano teachers right now, but I recognize we may not all be teachers. There may be some adult students here themselves, or there may be people who are on their journey toward becoming teachers of adults. But for today, I'll refer to all of us as teachers, but really we're all learners. And even facilitators of adults recognize that we spend, as long as we are working with adult students, we too are learning, and we are also on that journey of mastery. But the important thing is that both parties really enjoy that process of piano study. So hopefully you'll get a few ideas today, and we'll be able to share some at the end as well. So I'm going to sort of mention this throughout the presentation today, but this, I think, is the crux of the matter for me and for many of my adult students. So for many adults, the piano really is the vehicle. It's the vehicle that allows them to make music at the piano and to meet their musical goals, their learning goals. And that it may seem self-evident, that comment, but sometimes we get very caught up in this big beast of an instrument that's in front of us when we're in a lesson with a student. And we just get so caught up with the instrument. But for most of my students, that piano is just the vehicle. And so yes, we need to master it. We need to learn the technique. We need to have some basic understanding. But it's all in service of the music. It's so that we can play that music that we love so dearly. And even if an adult doesn't state that as a goal necessarily. We often learn throughout that musical journey of lessons together that that really is an important goal and an important part of making music. It's using the piano to do that. If you attended the previous webinar, you probably recognize this cycle here. I use it frequently. If you've been to any of our NCKP sessions with the Adult Learning Committee, you've probably seen it as well. But if not, don't worry, the webinar is archived. You can certainly go back and review it. And I will say that webinar from 2018, it really is sort of a nice little primer, if you will, for working with adult students, you know, in general, and for understanding who the adult learner is from an andragogy, not a pedagogy, but an adult and andragogy perspective. So I won't repeat really any of that material because it's already available to you. But I do want to remind us of this cycle. And so if you look at the 1 o'clock on this circle here, this is presumably where most of our adult students enter into the learning arrangement with us, right? So we're preparing the learner. We're then establishing that climate where they're going to learn. And we're going to talk about that quite a bit in the next few minutes. And that's both a physical space, which I won't talk about as much, but it is certainly worth considering. But it's also that emotional space where an adult who's very vulnerable about learning something new for the first time, or returning to the piano after many years, perhaps, of absence, or perhaps, you know, maybe they didn't have a great experience with the last teacher. So that climate that we establish for learning is crucial for enabling the learning that's going to take place with adult students here. There's a mutual planning that happens. We'll talk a little bit about that. Certainly as teachers, we need to diagnose the needs of the learner. What you'll find is most of your adult students come in with some pretty clear objectives, or a lot of them will come in with clear ideas about what they want to learn, and perhaps even ideas about what they need to learn. Some of these may be accurate. Some may not be. That's fine. It actually helps to begin that dialogue and to start diagnosing. And then the last three phases of this cycle, if you will, are more familiar to us regardless of the age of student with whom we work, where we're, you know, formulating objectives, we're conducting the learning itself, and then we're evaluating outcomes. I mean, this is just the typical sequence of events in any teaching learning scenario. And this, of course, still happens with the adult. But, you know, again, the whole process here is cyclic, and it's helpful for us to remember that as educators, as teachers of adult students, and also to remember that at any point we may need to sort of revisit parts of these, right? We may need to revisit our goals and objectives. We may need to re-diagnose some of the needs. So you can ponder that. So on this slide now, I'm going to sort of list just a few of the roles, the responsibilities that we have as a teacher. I would argue these are responsibilities regardless of the age of student. But what I have on the right-hand column of the slide here would be some of the questions that an adult might ask. So just sample representative questions. Of course, there are tons of other questions. But what it highlights is that our adults don't come to us as a tabula rasa, right? They are not blank slates. They have a lifetime of musical experiences. And it doesn't matter if they're 25 and that lifetime is shorter than the 75-year-old who comes to our studio. They still have musical experiences. Some of these may have been formal in the distant past or recent past. Some of them may have been at the piano itself, or they may have been at other instruments. They may have been in ensemble settings, choir, band, those sorts of things. So everyone comes to us, well, and of course, they've experienced music. I mean, we cannot live without experiencing music in many forms. So we come to the lesson regardless of our age, regardless of our ability level at the piano, with past experiences. Now, why does a teacher come to us? This is a point that I like to make when I speak with teachers about working with adult students, because in the world of adult education, there is an assumption that adults can really, they know what they need, and that they can conduct a lot of the learning independently. And this is true to a certain extent with piano, but we all need coaches. We all need mentors. I mean, this is part of developing a very sophisticated set of skills, which playing the piano consists of. And I would also say there are many ways a student these days can also do some informal learning. There are tons of YouTube videos on how to play such and such a piece or how to play this style. There are also more formal asynchronous forms of instruction, but they're still asynchronous, so there's no feedback with the teacher. These may be excellent, but a student may still find themselves at a point where they've worked through this set of materials, and now they really do need feedback from a teacher, someone who can, observe them from the outside and really diagnose what's happening, help them get through some hurdles. And it may be that they just simply need, they want to work on different repertoire, something that's not available to them. So the presumption really is when they come to us for piano lessons, they need us. And we have a set of skills which we can share and help them to develop. So it is our responsibility to share that knowledge and our expertise. Now, it has to be appropriately sequenced. This goes without saying. Again, this would be true at any level, but it's especially true for adults. Because one of the things you may have experienced in the past is because adults are highly motivated quite frequently, and because they do know how to locate external informal learning resources, they can go online, they can get information, and they may come back to you and say, well, I found this. I'd like to learn about this. I'll share a story. I happen to have an asynchronous, I like to think, well-sequenced video series that a number of people use around the world. And just recently, one of the students emailed me and had a question. And, he said, I've been taking your course and really enjoying it. He was only in lesson 5. I'm wondering why I'm not playing an octave scale yet. And my wife plays the piano and she's wondering as well. This is an excellent question. And an adult who is thinking and who has some prior experience with music knows where they want to go. Of course, they're going to be asking this question. It may be a little unrealistic to think we're going to play a whole octave scale, in week 5, but how does someone who's not a pianist know that, right? So these questions are great, and it gave me the opportunity to have a little email exchange and to assure the gentleman that we will get to, the full octave scale when the time is right, when we've done the prep activities. But in the meantime, he'll still be doing lots of wonderful music and playing lots of music. So that's an experience from just 2 weeks ago, literally from my recent past. The material also has to be age appropriate. This is really important, and this is something that many, many, many adults have shared with me over the years. They don't like being talked down to, if you will. That's often how they phrase it, because they are fully formed beings, or, as much as any of us are fully formed. That's part of our journey. And they have a good sense of how they learn. So they really don't want to deal with childish materials, but really age appropriate. And we're lucky in piano. I think more than any other instrument, I can say that. We have plenty of published materials available for adult students. I've used so many of these with great success. Some of them need, more interaction with me. I may have to supply more supplements. That's fine. I'm happy to do that. But, I really don't have to resort to things with childish pictures on them or even to childhood methods. There are excellent adult methods out there. And the other important thing, which hopefully I've been sort of demonstrating and discussing a little bit in the past couple of moments speaks to, this question I have over here on the right that the adult is asked, like, what does this exercise, how does that help me reach this goal I have of playing for release, right? Well, if we make the activities meaningful for the student, and if we help them understand how it will help them meet their ultimate goal, this can be really beneficial. So another important responsibility for us as teachers is to help the adult student reach reasonable goals. Now, I was very purposeful in putting the word reasonable in here. Again, if you've worked with adults, they will often have unrealistic goals for how they see themselves progressing. And it's just a lack of experience with the instrument, a lack of understanding how much time it really does take to master some of these complex motor skills that we're developing, not to mention the processing of the notes on the page if we're reading written notation on the piano stand. Just give me one moment here. I have a little pop-up from my university. Sorry, I apologize. Okay, needed me to verify my identity. I'm good to go now. So this is part of the dialogue that we engage in with our adults about really redefining what these goals are. I like to think of them as objectives and goals. For me, objectives are smaller. They are shorter term, meaning, I can check them off. I can feel successful more frequently. But all of these help me work toward my ultimate goal, whatever that may be. And it's okay to say, we're not going to be able to learn for release by the end of this year. But then I might explore with the student, what if it's really about the repertoire, is there another piece that might be just as exciting for me to play? Or is it really about just being able to play something recognizable? So at that point, maybe I can find an arrangement of a piece that the student would recognize and find great pleasure in playing. So it is about drilling down a little bit to get to the root of what the goals really are, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And then, of course, it's really planning the learning and the learning sequences and scaffolding these so that everything builds upon the next and that a student will be successful. So again, you see on the right of my slide here some of the questions a student might ask. So you want to be thinking through and have good answers for the student. And finally, I would say here, another great responsibility that we have for our students is to really consider their previous musical experiences. And so I spoke about this when I first turned to this slide. What does the student bring to the lesson in terms of past experience? And, here I'll share a story too, and it's a little bit of a caveat if you do teach younger people as well, because you never know what people remember. But, a number of people of a certain age, and I would put myself in here, have a very hierarchical notion of the teacher-student relationship. And in certain cultures, that's more prevalent than it certainly seems to be today with our youth in American culture. But, so this kind of learning environment that is more mutual, I'll say, can be challenging for some adults at first because they may come to us and they just may want us to give them all the answers. And that style of teaching, you may have to go a little more toward that for that kind of student. But it may be that buried there really are some experiences that just have somehow impacted them, and they feel that my opinion doesn't matter, or you don't want to hear what I'm feeling about this piece when I play, or, I'm just throwing a few little examples out there. So I think it's important for us when we teach to know that we're working with this student for a moment in time. And it's a great honor, actually, to be able to make music and help that student develop the skills they need to be able to play this wonderful music. But they may leave us. You know, this journey that we're sharing together with each student it's for a limited amount of time. But the student may then, you know, go on their merry way, but come back to piano again at a later date. And we want to be sure that every interaction we've had with the student, as much as possible within our ability, really has just given them a wonderful experience of what making music can be. So, you know, I throw that out there because I had a student once who I was amazed came back to piano, actually. And the reason I was amazed was because he had, as a middle school student, was taking piano and football. These were the only two things, you know, he was doing. And his piano teacher at one point said, well, if you're going to play football, that's it. You can no longer play piano. You can't take lessons with me. You're not serious enough about it. And I think she was worried about injury and that sort of thing. Again, this was many years ago. This was probably 70 years ago. So, you know, I like to think our teaching has evolved a little. But, you know, for many students, and he made his choice. He chose football, of course. He was in middle school. So, you know, but for many students, they might never find their way back to piano. And, you know, the interesting thing is that this gentleman, he was with a group that I was working with, and he ended up with dementia. And in the end, that group became a very important lifeline for him because he remembered enough of what he had learned that he could play. And, you know, I can share more details later if we have time for the story, but it was an outlet for him when really there was very little left that he could do toward the very end of his life. Let me just see, I have a note here that, okay, so people are asking about some specific material and repertoire for adults. Let me get to that at the end. So don't fixate on that right now. That's my suggestion. I will recommend some materials at the end. Yeah, great questions. So these are the things I've put here on your left that I think are important responsibilities. There are others for us as adult teachers. But, you know, it's in contrast with the child, teacher, parent triangle, which is very hierarchical, right? It puts the student at the top. And I'm not saying that the adult student isn't at the top of this relationship. But what I am saying is that I think it's more on a continuum, actually. And, you know, I will say I gain as much from the learning experience, I think sometimes as my student does, in different ways, obviously. But it's much more collaborative. It's a partnership, and we're sharing and learning together. Now, if there are certain things when I'm, sequencing materials and trying to build the scaffolding necessary for the technical development, where I may need a student to trust me more. And at that point, they would shift more to that facilitator side of the continuum. But, you know, if a student comes in with a piece that they'd like to learn and it looks like it's at the appropriate level, perhaps it wasn't on my radar, and I'm open to doing that, then, you know, we shift a little bit more toward the student side of that continuum. So it's, you know, again, no one has all of the power. It's really a shared power. It's quite democratic, actually, and quite heartening. So, yeah, everything's done in partnership with the student. Now, there's one more continuum that I'd like to just sort of throw out here right now, and I think it's worth thinking about when you are designing, if you will, learning experiences for your student. So if we're looking at leisure students, so I'm not talking about young adults who want to become professional musicians, they're a separate league, or even professional musicians who go back and study piano or continue to study piano, as many teachers do. This is, you know, truly the leisure learner. So the student who has a different profession, they are true amateurs. They engage in music making for the pure love of it. This doesn't mean they can't or won't attain really a respectable level of musicianship. Some will, some may not. But I like to look at this as everything from I have RMM to serious student. Now, that is not to denigrate RMM and say these students are not serious. They are. They go to class. They want to engage in music making. But on that side of the continuum, for our purposes today, let's think of this as a student who may be engaged in a class situation, a group piano situation, although it doesn't have to be. I've had plenty of RMM students who come for private lessons, and they value that 30 minutes with me every week. That's of great value to them. But they don't necessarily want to put in a lot of effort outside of the lesson for practicing. And that's okay. I can design a learning experience where there's music making that happens during the lesson, and we pick up from there next time, and we reinforce, and little by little we may progress, but it's really not about progressing. And so these are not necessarily beginners either. They may be students who have attained a certain level of proficiency, and they just want to maintain that. But at this other end of the continuum, we have the more serious student who might be very interested in progressing. I also don't want to suggest that that student only takes private lessons, that they wouldn't participate in a group piano setting, because they absolutely could. And I don't want to suggest that that serious student is always advanced, because I would argue that they're not advanced, technically or musically always, but they're serious in that they, outside of the lesson, outside of the class, they do spend a great deal of time at the piano. They could be working on lots of things, but they will spend time working on the repertoire, on the exercises, on the music that we are working on in lessons. So just know that a student can fall anywhere on this continuum, but also remember, if 2020 and the beginning of 2021 have taught us nothing, it's that, as adults, we are all at the mercy of forces greater than ourselves. So life happens. Life circumstances change. I think back to an adult that I had, and she was an excellent student, very serious. But, when her teenage daughter started experiencing some bullying at school and was really struggling socially, she still kept her piano lessons. That 45 minutes a week with me was really important to her. And not just for the social interaction, although that may have been part of it, but for this, talking about music and making music and just taking our mind off of the other worries of life for just, that hour a week. But it meant that she really wasn't able to practice outside of the lesson. And I found a way to work with her because I recognized that she still valued the music making that we were doing in the lesson. So it means we redefine what progress is, right? This is why, I'm talking about process quite a bit today. So just to remind you, you're diagnosing, you're planning, you're revisiting often, but you're remaining flexible. Okay, so this is my process versus product portion of the portion of our hour here today. So, a quick reminder that music is the vehicle for helping adults to meet their goals. I do recommend that you do interviews with your adult students. I recommend sending some questions for them to think about before they begin lessons with you, whether that's in a group setting or in individual lessons, because often adults have very clearly articulated goals. But when we drill a little deeper, there are other goals and other needs being met. And so I would encourage you to consider those. So I'll share, for example, a story of a student who said, and I didn't know this, she kept coming back to class, she was part of a group, and she said, the need that one of the needs that this is meeting for me is that my daughter is a professional musician. She's an educator. My granddaughter now is starting music school. She's a freshman. And now, and I practiced through the week, and now there's a shared language that we can speak about. She had participated in music her whole life. She was actively participating in choir. But this was something personal that she was doing and practice that she was really undertaking on her own outside of class, and then she'd come back to class and make music with others. And it gave her a new connection just to family members. I mean, I don't think that's something that she recognized even was a goal when she came, when she started class with us. But by 6 years in, as circumstances had changed and her granddaughter had, become a music major, what we saw was that music had always been important in the family. And this now gave her another access point, entry point for communicating with her family, which is amazing. This notion of practicing or playing versus performing is also important. Many, many adults will come to you and they will say, I do not want to perform, and we need to value that. Having said that, I have started groups for adults where performing was a stated goal of the class. Now, it was never solo performance, it was always ensemble, and it was always sort of in outreach, truly outreach, not engagement, but outreach in the community where they felt like they were able to share their music with others. The group would go around to retirement communities and perform, especially at Christmas time, they would do Christmas carols and we'd do sing-alongs and that sort of thing. But we would also do this in the spring and summer as well. And they saw that as a real service, that they were able to share their music with others, and others clearly gained joy from that. So performing can be something that an adult wants to do. And I know many, many adults who are in studios where there's an end of semester recital for adults only, and they participate and share. Others do duets, and that's a performance in a way. So, I just think we need to be very clear when we're designing our lessons and the learning activities so that it meets the needs and the stated goals, right? So if we're preparing for an end of semester recital or end of semester duets, we want to rehearse these duets in lessons. We want to make sure that's part of the activity. But if we are not preparing for a recital, that changes the paradigm for us in terms of what happens in lessons, right? And that's totally different from what happens with most childhood lessons, where there is always, and I won't say always, but lots of times, an end of semester recital. There are festivals that students are playing for. It's the most common indicator we have of how well a student is doing, their performance. But that is not necessarily the case for our adult students. So that's just a reminder here. Also knowing if the student is, motivated by the learning themselves. I had one student say, when we were sort of speaking and talking about, okay, do you feel like we're doing enough? Do you want to do a little more in the lesson? And she said, oh, no, this is enough. I mean, she was practicing, she was accomplishing her goals. So I was checking in to see if she felt like she wanted to do more. And she said, oh no, this is perfect. I'm learning just a little something every week. I'm able to go home and work on it. I feel a sense of satisfaction. That's all I need. Whereas I've had other students and they say, okay, now I've done this. Let's push a little bit. Let's see if I can get a little farther. All the time remembering that learning is not linear, and reminding our students that learning is not linear. Progress on the piano, as we all know, is not linear. So that's also part of that conversation that we're reminding our students about. Also, identifying these buried goals. So I interviewed an adult once, and she didn't participate in recitals. She was taking lessons with a teacher in a community music school, and they offered recitals for adults, but she didn't do them. So because she said it really wasn't important. And I came to learn, though, that there was a performance aspect that was important for her, and it was playing duets with her grandson. He lived, not close to her, and when he came to visit, she wanted to be able to sit down with him and play duets. On a similar vein, another student, she was not a pianist, but I think the story works, who also said, no, I don't want to perform. And yet she, on her instrument, was part of a small little group of like-minded adults who went out to a nursing home in their small community once a month and performed folk music for the residents. So she didn't identify that as performance, but she wanted to learn enough so that she could go out into and play with her friends and feel confident and know that her technique was going to be there. And it turns out she hadn't shared those performances with her teacher. So her teacher was not aware, right? This is why it's so important, because a student may think, well, that's not important for my teacher to know. We're working on XYZ here. But actually it is, because it may change what we do in the lesson and the learning priorities that we have. And I just sort of end this set of slides with this notion of the master's journey. I mean, in a way, we're all on that master's journey, which is very circuitous, but reminding our adult piano students of this can be really important, because many of them do come in with this notion that I'm going to take lessons, I'm going to study with this great teacher, and after 2 semesters, I'm going to be in pretty good shape. I'm going to be able to, play whatever it is, or I'm going to be able to play for my friends, and, and the reality is it just takes time, right? What we do at the piano, it's an embodied kind of learning, where we're training muscles, we're learning this way, but we're also, learning to decipher complex symbolic notation on a score. We're learning to listen to what we're doing and make adjustments to our playing. And we're just learning to refine technique. And this doesn't happen overnight. But once adults realize this, many of them savor that journey. Now, some of them think of it as that kind of a journey all along, right? Where there will be plateaus and there will be hills and valleys and those sorts of things. But I think the important thing is for us to be aware of changes in student behavior during lessons or in changes in practicing. Again, some of these are perfectly understandable, but navigating these with the student can help, right? So even things like, let me share this story with, especially as we age, but really for all of us, if we don't get enough sleep, this hampers the ability to learn as efficiently as we normally do. So I had a student at one point come in and she was beating herself up. I mean, she was open with me about it, that she just wasn't able to learn this piece. And through the course of the lesson, I learned that her in-laws were visiting. Her husband was recovering from a major surgery, so she was sort of caretaking for him. She was sort of taking care of her in-laws. Her whole routine had been switched. She hadn't been getting enough sleep. So even though she was still getting the same amount of practice time, she was distracted. There were other factors that were needing her attention, and she was, really tired. So she just wasn't able to process. Once we realized that, she went easier on herself. And then, once everything settled down a few months later, she was back to her old way of learning. But she didn't make that connection. And so we can certainly help our students do that quite a bit. So, this slide here just simply says that many of those things that a student gains from a lesson are not articulated. And some of them don't need to be. Sometimes a student recognizes it. I'm lucky in that, throughout, well, my very first students actually were adults when I was much, much younger. But for the last 25 years, much of my research has been focused on adults. So, many of my adults agree to participate in studies or do interviews with me, after the fact or whatnot, which has opened up these lines of communication that I really try to establish anyway. But there are many, many things I've learned over the years, and then interviewing other people's students, certainly I learned lots, that music just brings so much to their lives. Being able to play music, even if it's not at the tempo, even if it's not, the way a concert pianist may play it, it's still very powerful to be a part of creating this music. And so, you might think, well, the composer created it. Yes, but I, as the pianist, have to bring it to life again. And that's the experience your students have in lessons with you and when they're at home practicing. Okay, just a few little strategies. I've really talked about a lot of these. So really understanding the student's motivation. And this can change, and it's often not what they think it is either. So just be on the lookout for that. Choosing appropriate music. Again, level and sequencing I've spoken about a little bit. The style is important, right? If a student says, I want to play for release, and I give them something that is not a classical style and not lots of finger passage work, that probably is not going to meet their need. Likewise, if a student says, I want to learn how to play jazz, and I agree to do that, even if they're, a beginner, there are still some resources out there. Yes, they're going to have to learn some basic technique, learn some chords, get some vocabulary, but I want to be sure I'm giving them repertoire that perhaps is a little bit more in that style. And so, I think of some great Larry Minsky pieces that come to mind that are really beginning level, early intermediate, but these satisfy that need for a student. And so many of the composers for piano really, they have lots of, music at various levels. So usually we can find something that's in the style of a composer. Or, for example, if a student's not ready for the Beethoven sonata that they want to learn, there are some late Diabelli sonatas or sonatinas that actually are longer, and that have harmonic progressions that are very reminiscent of Beethoven. And I find these to be helpful with my students. In terms of methods, every major North American publisher has a method for adult students, I would say. So I won't name names. I don't want to show favorites. I will say I've used all of them, and I have found a way to make all of them work. So we can talk a little bit more in question and answer period when I have the chat pulled up about that as well. I use ensembles a lot. Again, there are lots of ensembles on the market. I don't want to leave anyone out, but I find the Hal Leonard ensembles are beautifully arranged. They work well. They have accompaniments that you can play with your students if you need to fill in parts. Susan Ogilvie has a huge, a vast quantity of ensembles, everything from very easy to very complex. These work well at multiple keyboards, but you will find, again, every publisher from FJH to Alfred to Chose, they have, duets, 3-4 part ensembles as well. So the materials are out there. Co-creating those reasonable goals, we've talked about that. I think I've talked a lot about this environment a lot, but I think the thing is that if you've created this environment, it's one where curiosity is just a part of it, right? So rather than me, I might know how to fix a problem right away. I'm thinking of a video of a wonderful teacher I watched teaching an adult just a couple of months ago. And, the student was playing, might have been the Atwood Sonatina, actually. And, there was a little technical glitch in the passage, and he wasn't also taking enough time at that little recap, or at the little transition before the recap. And the teacher obviously could have just gone in and played it and said, just do this. But she didn't. She said, yeah, I noticed that, it felt a little rushed here. And I struggle with this sometimes too. And I wonder if you might consider what it would be like to take a little breath here. Just slow a little here, like you're, just sort of gently applying the brake on the car. Take a breath and then go on. And then she demonstrated. And then, of course, the student was, nodding in agreement. And he felt like he was part of that. He didn't feel like he was being told to do something, and this is the way it has to be done. But it was an invitation. And for many, many students, this is just sort of an enjoyable atmosphere. So they leave the lesson feeling like, wow, I've had this exchange. We've talked about music. We've tried it. They feel free if they try it and it doesn't work to say, no, that didn't work. That's the kind of environment that's truly engaging and enjoyable for both the student and the facilitator. I also want to take a minute and just speak about success, because we often have a very clearly defined notion of when a student has met with success. That may not match the students, right? The student may be listening to, Symphony Orchestra XYZ, who's a top professional orchestra, or they may be listening to, recordings of Leon Fleischer playing whatever, and they don't meet that standard. But if I can help a student understand what's improved, what they did so well that really, is amazing, especially for their level or for the amount of time we've been working on it, suddenly then they start understanding, acknowledging the success a little bit more. Your adult students will often, like many of us, they're looking ahead, they're trying to get better and better, but they don't realize what's improved and what they're doing well. And because we only see a student once a week, with an adult, sometimes it's once every other week, then we have the pleasure of seeing growth more than the individual does. Some students, if they're taking lessons individually, will need the interaction with others, just to know that they're not the only person experiencing this. It doesn't have to be a performance, because, you can call it a party, but they know that that's key for performance. And I've done both. I've had with groups of adults in the past, we've just had informal gatherings at the end of the semester where there's no playing. Don't bring your books. The piano lid will be closed, but we're going to just get together and, have a social hour, have some food, maybe talk about our semester, talk about our experiences, but there's no playing involved. Others where we do that, or where we do it on a more regular basis. And so the adult has to be comfortable with this, to be sure. If you're teaching group lessons only, or you're considering the gathering, on a regular basis, monthly or once a semester, you really do want to think about who's in the group. You want to also encourage group growth, so that the members are not sort of just growing individually, but they're doing things together. And this is where playing ensembles, duets, those kinds of things can help. And, and there are 5 stages of group growth. You can read about that elsewhere. But you want to get them past those initial awkward stages into what's actually called the performing stage, where they're able to work together, collaborate together. And this is especially important if you're in a piano lab setting and they're working, with headphones, and they're working on small ensembles, simultaneously in their individual little groups, where you're not monitoring each group. You're monitoring it, but you're not directing each ensemble. This is not always the case. I will also say what happens in this situation is that with the ensembles, the music they're making tends to be, as we say, greater than the sum of the parts, right? So this works especially well with less advanced students, even beginning students. It creates a different set of problems. They have to learn how to listen and respond and stay in time and those sorts of things. But it's done with the group, and everyone's experiencing the same thing, same problems, hopefully just not all at exactly the same time. Framing those learning objectives, or reframing them, so that individuals within the group are not disappointed, can be helpful. Okay, we're back to co-creating goals. In this case, I'll just share quickly an example of a group that I observed, and they were working on lead lines one semester. And I said to the teacher, why did you do this? And she said, well, I actually planted the seed a couple of semesters earlier. And then they sort of got on board. They realized they wanted to learn a little bit more about chords, and there were some melodies, some tunes they wanted to do that weren't available as arrangements. And, they ended up each purchasing a lead line book, and that was a portion of what they did during class each week. Engaging the individual is important. And leveraging the social aspect, I think, is important here. And that's where I'll stop today. But it's, I had a group once that they would literally, several groups would carpool together. And in that car, they would talk about their their fears, their successes, again, their struggles, and they supported each other. You know, and I know of lots of students now who will literally come, you know, 10 minutes before their class. I say now, this was before COVID, so that they could literally sit outside of the classroom and just talk. That was the only time that I saw that person, you know, during the week. And another advantage of groups is that you can get a diverse group of people together. You know, in the last research study I did when I was able to get out, this is something the students said. You know, they said, I see these people once a week. They are people I would not have met in any other situation. And they are really interesting. And it's just fun to learn music with them. And, you know, so there, again, that's not a musical value per se, but it's done through making music. Yeah. So I will stop there and kind of go to the chat, put my glasses on so I can kind of see some of this. Where can we go to read about the 5 stages of group growth? Sylvia Coates, in her book, Thinking as You Play, she uses 5 different stages than I use. If you Google Tuckman, Tuckman, group growth, you will see those 5 stages. It's used exclusively in business now. I actually do have a chapter in my book, Dynamic Group Piano Teaching, that speaks about this, and especially with relation to adults, because I think we see it with adults as well. Great question. Do you always begin teaching in reading notation in a beginner adult? No, not necessarily. And I think this again can be helpful if you, during the interview process, have gotten to know the adult a little bit, because, you know, the challenge with starting with notation right away is already we're going to be starting with seemingly less complex music than the adult is used to hearing. And it could be that if we don't, you know, that they can actually probably play some melodies, you know, by rote. We could start learning some things by ear. Maybe they already know some things by ear. So maybe there are some technical skills. So it really depends on the situation, Dawn, to answer your question here. Let me scroll. I have an older, okay, this is a question. I have an older adult who has a really tough time keeping the beat. He has a hard time counting out loud and speeds up. Any ideas? Yes, you're not the only one. It's not just older adults, though the older we get, processing time slows. So we have to be flexible. And the thing is, counting out loud, there's one theory in cognition that the reason counting out loud helps us is because we're bypassing working memory. We're using a different process, freeing up room in working memory. That's all great if the counting out loud has become automated. And I would bet that for this student, obviously the counting out loud is not automated. So that then becomes one additional thing on top of trying to play with the counting. So I think, you know, playing duets with that student can be helpful, because you can gently guide through your pulse, shall I say. Having the student work with pre-recorded accompaniments can help, whether you do those yourself or you use pre-recorded accompaniments available through a publisher, and many of them have those. So that's a great question. I have only a minute left. Esther, do I have time to answer another question or two? And I will say the questions I don't answer, we will keep track of them, and we will try to answer them in an upcoming question and answer column, either in the Piano Magazine and or, I don't want to commit to this because I'm not in charge of it, but the online digital questions and answers, and get some feedback from some other teachers of adult students as well. Do we have time for one more question? I know we're at the top of the hour, and I know many of you have to leave.
Yeah, we have time for one more question, Pam.
Okay. Okay, there's a question. Well, how do I know which one to choose? This is so hard. These are all excellent questions. Oh my goodness, it'll take me a minute to find a question. I'm sorry, now I'm seeing people I know. Hi everyone, it's so great to see you. Okay, do you have So I'll answer this question. How do you balance students choosing their own pieces versus assigning, introducing them to beautiful, interesting pieces? Well, I mean, that is the challenge, right, with our adult students. And, a good friend of mine who will be presenting at NCKP this summer in the Adult Learning Pre-Conference Day, I remember her once saying, sometimes you just have to let the adult student try it. And I will say, I have an adult right now who, she's a good sport. She goes along with me, and she'll kind of do the pieces that I, suggest we do in the meantime. But she really does want to work on these really challenging pieces that are going to just consume, or could consume, the whole lesson, and will consume her practice. So the deal I've made, so let me just give that personal example for you, and then you can extrapolate from there. So we do that. So we do some of both. And she has a really challenging, her really challenging pieces that she works on. And she probably spends hours and hours throughout the week working on them. But she will then choose just a small segment that she will bring back to me in the lesson. And we have a sort of a time limit, so that I want to give due diligence to the music she's working on, and I want us to work on it. But I also recognize, and she recognizes, that working on these other beautiful pieces, again, that also are helping develop those skills that will help with the more advanced repertoire, can allow her to develop those skills. And then, so we spend part of the time on that as well, so that she's achieving success. But this is a student who, even when she's not, what you and I might quote, call successful on the really, really, really challenging stuff, she's still gaining pleasure from it. And she's still enjoying that process. And sometimes we'll put, that piece to bed for a few months, and maybe a year later we take it out again. And in light of the other work she's done, she then has more success with it. So that's one way I've navigated. But it's a negotiation, if you will. I think sometimes just playing these pieces for our students so they hear them and hear how beautiful they are can make a difference, or, sending recording links or whatnot to students.